Hello, everybody. You're welcome to this episode of the Accountants Club podcast. Now, in the last episode, we talked about this decade being the real defining decade for accountants in practice. And moving on from that, what does that mean for accountants in practice? Like, what's the practicalities and what's the steps I need to take? And how do we bridge from the last episode to actual practical stuff? And so the real thing is we need a roadmap. And a roadmap will lay out exactly the steps that we need to take in order to move and to make this defining decade really important in our own practice. We need to understand what that means for us on a day-to-day basis. So I want to introduce you to something that we've designed called the advisory ladder. And then what I want to ask you is, where do you sit and where does your firm sit on the steps of this ladder? Understanding the ladder will give you a mechanism and a framework to decide how you're going to move forward into the future. So the basic first question is, what exactly is an advisory ladder? It's a really simple model that shows the different levels where accountants operate at. And there is 5 steps on this ladder. And the first step and the first rung on the ladder is compliance. And we're all very familiar with the compliance, and we're all well educated on what compliance and what the compliance offering is. The next rung on the ladder is reporting. So when we take all this compliance, we actually report it back to all the relevant authorities. We report it back to the clients themselves and any stakeholders that are relevant within the business, or any stakeholders relevant to the particular business you're working with. The next step is where we start moving now, and we start changing, and we start moving the practice into the next level. And the next step really is insights. So what insights can we initially, as the client's advisor, give to the client in the first instance on the information that we have created or worked with, or the information that we're looking at? The next thing is we need to understand what insights that the stakeholders and the readers of the information are going to take, as in the revenue, HMRC, whoever it is on that side, creditors, whoever the stakeholders relevant to your information. And then they'll draw their own insights from this. So the insights is the connector really between the past, the present, and the future. And then when we move from insights, and this is something that we do automatically and it's inherent in our DNA, we provide insights based on all the information without even knowing it, without even inferring that we're doing this. So what we're trying to do is put this into an actual very structured format. We move from insights then to giving advice. And the advice is the advisory advice based on the work we've done. We give advice back to the client. And we're saying, we believe that you should do X, Y, and Z. So you need to talk to a commercial solicitor. You need to have a conversation with a financial advisor. And we're advising the client based on the information we're using, or we need to look at your cash flow, and based on what you have in your cash flow, you're going to end up running out of cash, or you're going to have surplus cash. So that advice model that we take and that advice model that we do, that's the 4th of the stages of the ladder. But the last stage of the ladder is really where everything really becomes a high level, high advanced, and it's the area where when we reach this level, we've reached the final level of this, and this is leadership. So how, as a leader of our business and how as a leader of that, can we perform and can we have conversations with the company down the road? So we've clearly defined now the 5 stages of the advisory ladder. So on those 5 stages, why does this matter? And what's the real defining moment of what does it matter really? And why does it matter if you're on stage 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? And it's very clear. This is a really poignant point in all this. Each rung of the ladder has a different value. It has a different revenue value. No matter when you're on one rung of the ladder, the next rung has a different advisory and a hugely different commercial value. But it also has an emotional value to the client, and it has a huge other values, not just financial. But for us, what we're looking at here is increasing the growth and the value of the firm. And in terms of that, each rung has a different ladder. But the other big point of this is the higher you climb on the ladder, the more irreplaceable you become to the client. So if you're just doing compliance and basic reporting, and we've talked previously about the defining decade, and we've talked about how when you just do those things, not mean just in a disrespectful way, but when you do those things and these become commoditized, and the value drops in what they're worth to the firm, then we have a real problem. So understanding the advisory ladder and where you're going, so the higher you climb, the more irreplaceable you come. So therefore, as you get upwards, the client becomes more reliant on your services, or you become more valuable, more importantly, to the client. So everything we do should add 10x of a value to the client. All the advice and everything we give should be able to define a 10x value to this. So the higher you climb, the more irreplaceable you come. And now what we have to ask ourselves is, where are you today in your own firm on that ladder? And the first thing we do is take a step back and we look at the practice overall and we ask ourselves, how do I know which rung of the ladder I'm on? And I've just a couple of notes here and some signs. So signs of being stuck in compliance, poor time, fee pressure. They're two big signs that you're stuck on that rung of the ladder. Signs of reporting only, lots of reports, little impact. You're in the reporting line. Signs of being in the advice area where the clients come to you first. So if the clients are coming asking questions for you, you're in that kind of advice, the leadership model. And really where it works is when you go to the client with information and they come back to you, then that's the high levels of this stuff. So understanding the rung of the ladder you're on is really important. In a practice, step back in the practice as a whole, and then you have to bring this down a level, and you have to say to yourself, well, I'm at the compliance level, but for John down the road, I'm at the advice and leadership level, and for the other person, I'm at the leadership level. So individual clients will naturally move to different levels. And what we're trying to do is level up that playing field. So what we call your A clients or your top clients, they're at the advice and leadership, but then you have other clients that are down the rung of the ladder. So we're trying to understand at each rung where the client sits in terms of the advisory ladder. That helps us immensely being able to recognize how we can move them people and if we want to move them, and if they're appropriate to move them. So if you're stuck consistently in compliance as a practice, you recognize there's 4 other stages and you recognize you need to really make a shift within your firm. So what's the one real story of climbing the ladder? I suppose if I can share a little example with you, a firm that added KPI boards, just simple boards using Futurely, to a client when they were going to sit down to review their annual compliance. It changed the client meetings. It positioned us and the accountant as that trusted advisor. So therefore, this small journey and the tiny little movements that we make starts to shift us up the ladder. We start moving up the ladder very slightly and very slowly if we're a bit nervous about doing it. But by doing that, you are actually shifting up, and the recognition of that and having a framework to recognize, well, yeah, that's it. That's the appropriate way of doing it. But then you're moving up one rung at a time. But then what's the mistakes that I have made and that other people have made? When you write them down and take a step back, to look a little bit silly, but this is actually what happens. First of all, on the advisory journey, you end up with probably the principal or some of the partners or whoever it is giving the advice. So they're moving straight from compliance straight up to strategic advice. And then the team is trying to catch up. And then the business owner gets really busy and he says, this advice stuff doesn't work. I'm doing too much work. So you have to take a step back and say, okay, how do we do this a little bit more organized? So trying to jump straight from compliance to strategic advice is one of the problems and the mistakes that the accountants make. It's not about the leap and how fast you can jump from one to the other. It's about one rung at a time. And if we position ourselves and do the one rung at a time, then we are going to absolutely make this a real reality within our firm and within our practice. So what's the practical steps then of moving up one rung at a time? I suppose the first, if you're in compliance, start with reporting automation. Start building dashboards for your clients. Start understanding, and real simple dashboards, we talked about that the last time. The simpler the dashboard, the better, because the client will only read headline information. They're not going to get deep down into depreciation or four levels of cash flow, all of that. They're not interested in that. They want to know the time, not how the clock works. The second thing, if you're into reporting, we need to start asking better questions. We need to move into agent mode. And we'll talk about that on the next podcast. But if you're in reporting, we need to figure out, if we ask better questions, we're going to get better answers. We're going to position ourselves as this trusted advisor. Now, if you're in the advice mode, what's the next level up? We do this one plan and leadership. That's the ultimate level here. You go in the advice mode, you go from one plan and the leadership level. So it is a very clear step level. Here's where you are, here's where you go, here's the next step, here's the next step. What I want you to understand is as well, there's another little nuance that comes in here. The different stages of the business makes this a little bit more complicated. So if you're at the business at a startup, a grow, a scale, or a harvest, each of those different steps denotes for you and for the practice that we have to have a different plan for the different stages. Because if somebody's coming in at a startup, they're going to want advice and a bit of leadership, because they're going to want to know all the things that we actually need to sit down and plan out. And that's a very distinct. So in terms of training your team and your staff, it is a brilliant way to get somebody that has that bit of entrepreneurship about him, I think is the word I'm looking for, within the practice, and you put them on the startups and you explain to them, and they're sitting down, they know all this. Here's the steps, here's the top 50 things you have to do to get a business. You need to pick your business name, you need to understand the niche you're in. And they're moving through the ladder really quickly. So you can move up and down within the ladder. You can go up and down the steps of the ladder in that startup mode. The grow, scale, and harvest, you need a different types of advice, but the framework will never change. And the advisory ladder will never change, no matter what stage of the business you're at. That's critical. And that's a very clear understanding of how do we do this. I suppose now what I want to talk about is what's the challenge I would give you today if you're listening to this podcast. And the challenge I would ask you to understand is, what rung on the ladder am I genuinely on within the practice? In the practice overall, and then within the different client modes. And then what I want you to do is I want you to write down one thing you do this quarter to move one rung on the ladder for one client. That's a very, very, very simple action, but you're moving the treadmill, you're starting to flywheel, you're starting to turn it. And once you start this thing to turn it, it's a slow momentum at the start, same as learning anything. So what's really the takeaway message I have for you on this? I suppose the advisory ladder is your guide and framework for making this the defining decade for your practice. And it gives you a way and a method of moving within and through your business and through your practice. The second thing is it'll slow you down to speed you up. It's not about jumping to the top. It's about climbing steadily and training steadily. They're the two takeaways I want you to take with this. So for you, what's the next step? You need to share, come in and share your ladder position where you are. Reach out and share the ladder position. Put it in the comments on this, and just let's see where different people are. And the next episode, what we're going to dig into is the agent mode, which is about asking better questions. So when you ask better questions to your client, this will automatically bring you up the ladder. And be confident, be really confident, because you're more than capable of doing this within the industry you're in. If you're a qualified accountant, you're more than capable of beginning this journey and making this move. And I want to close with the numbers tell a story, but it's your advice that changes the ending. Remember that the numbers tell a story, but it's your advice that changes the ending. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it, and I'll talk to you on the next episode.